I always thought I had a solid grasp of my life, my wife, and the world we had created together. The years had unfolded with such predictability that I never questioned it. We had been married for nearly 30 years. In that time, we'd built a home, weathered some challenges, and settled into a life that, though not glamorous, was comfortable. There were no great excitements or disruptions, just the two of us, side by side, navigating the small, steady rhythm of life. Our house, nestled on the edge of town, was modest. Nothing ostentatious or grand about it, but it was whole. A small, neat garden out back, a cozy living room where we'd spend quiet evenings, a kitchen where she would prepare the meals I'd come to expect after all these years. The house wasn't large, but it was enough, just enough for the two of us. We had never wanted children, never felt the need for. Our lives were ours, and that had always been fine. She worked as a teacher at a local school, a job that gave her purpose and, of course, a steady income. I worked in middle management at a company nearby. It wasn't the most exciting job, but it paid the bills. We were comfortable, modestly so, but we weren't struggling. Our routine was simple. Every morning, we'd wake up, I'd go off to work, and she'd go to her school. Evenings were spent in the same way: dinner, TV, a bit of quiet conversation, and then sleep. The weekends were often a little more eventful, with trips to the local farmer's market or walks around the neighborhood. Nothing extravagant, but it was enough. At the time, I never doubted that this was how it was supposed to be. This was what life was: stable, dependable, predictable. That was the foundation we had built our lives on. There was nothing spectacular about it, but it was ours. We'd grown older together, and I thought that meant I knew her, knew everything about her, and that our bond was unshakable. Then, one day, she mentioned him. I didn't think much of it at first, but that was the moment everything started to change. She told me, matter-of-factly, that a man from her past would be coming into town. He was an old friend, someone she'd known before me, a childhood sweetheart. They hadn't seen each other in years, but he was reaching out to reconnect. Of course, there was no reason for me to feel uneasy. It was nothing more than two people catching up. They'd had their past, and I had mine. We were adults, and I didn't think for a second that there was anything to worry about. She had always had people from her past drift in and out of her life. This would be no different. But as the days passed, I began to notice small things that, in retrospect, should have alerted me. I didn't think much of them at first. She began spending more time on her phone, texting him more often, stepping away when I entered the room. The casual mentions of them increased, always framed as old memories or catching up on old times. But I could feel a subtle shift in the air. It wasn't anything overt, nothing blatant that would have raised immediate suspicion. But something wasn't right. I tried to ignore it at first. After all, we had always trusted each other implicitly. She had no reason to betray that trust, and I had no reason to suspect anything untoward. But my gut began to tighten with an uneasy feeling I couldn't shake. I'd never been a man who questioned things. My life had always been straightforward, and that's how I liked it. I didn't go searching for drama or trouble where there was none. I trusted her implicitly, and that trust had always been rewarded. Why would I start doubting her now? Yet, there was a nagging feeling that refused to go away. I told myself I was overthinking it, that everything was fine. The phone calls became more frequent. The messages seemed longer, more personal. I noticed her smile more when she spoke about him. And there were the lunches, just the two of them, catching up. Again, nothing to worry about, right? But every time she came home from one of these meetings, there was something different about her. She seemed a little too cheerful, a little too distant. There was a warmth in her voice when she spoke about him, something I hadn't heard before. Still, I convinced myself it was nothing. Just old friends reconnecting. What harm could there be in that? The days passed, and I began to observe more closely, unable to rid myself of the growing sense of unease. There was no hard evidence, no concrete reason to think that anything was wrong. But I couldn't deny the feeling that something was changing. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. It was as if she was slipping away from me, little by little, as she rekindled a bond with someone from her past. We went about our days as usual, and yet everything felt different. I couldn't place my finger on it, but I felt a disconnect I hadn't felt before. The thing was, I trusted her. I always had. There had been no reason not to. She had always been my partner, my constant. I had no reason to doubt her. But there was an undercurrent of something I couldn't ignore, and though I couldn't yet name it, I felt the change in the air. It was the calm before the storm, and I had no idea how much my life was about to unravel. What was once a steady, predictable existence was beginning to feel like a house built on sand. As the days passed, I began to notice the shifts more clearly. Her phone calls, once casual, became longer, more involved. It wasn't so much the frequency of them that stood out, but the change in her demeanor when she spoke about him. There was a softness in her voice, a warmth that wasn't there before. I could sense it, even when she was just talking about trivial things. She would smile in a way that was unfamiliar, a glint in her eyes that I hadn't seen in years. It was subtle, but undeniable. I tried to push the thoughts aside. I wanted to believe there was nothing to worry about. After all, they had history, didn't they? A past before. She had always talked about it, about the things they had done as children, the moments they'd shared before our paths had crossed. There was nothing wrong with that, nothing wrong with rekindling a friendship from long ago. But as the weeks went on, I found myself wondering if there was more to their connection than just shared memories. One evening, after she came home from one of their meetings, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was different. Her usual energy was there, her laughter, the way she moved around the house. But there was something else, something in her touch, in the way she reached for my hand, a hesitance I hadn't noticed before. It wasn't that she had become distant, not exactly, but there was a change in the way she interacted with me, a difference I couldn't quite place. I noticed it more when we sat down to dinner. The conversation was there, the usual talk about her day, my work, and the small details of our routine. But there was a kind of distance in her gaze, not in a negative way, but in a way that made me feel like I was being shut out of something. She was physically present, yes, but mentally, emotionally, she seemed somewhere else, somewhere I couldn't reach. It didn't help that her mood had lightened, that she seemed to be glowing in a way I hadn't seen before. She'd always been beautiful, but there was something different now, an energy that wasn't just from her usual warmth, but something else, something new. And as much as I wanted to attribute it to the joy of seeing an old friend after years, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was no longer the one who made her smile in that way. One night, after she had gone to bed, I found myself lying awake, staring at the ceiling. I couldn't sleep. I had always been a deep sleeper, but now I found myself tossing and turning, unable to quiet the thoughts that plagued me. I wondered if I had missed something, if I had been blind to the signs. Maybe this was all in my head, just a product of my own insecurities. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I had always been able to read her, to know when something was off, and right now, everything felt off. I tried to push it down, tried to focus on the present, on the life we had built together, but the ceiling wouldn't leave. It was a slow, creeping suspicion that began to take root in my chest. The following week, I had the chance to observe them more closely. I'd been meaning to leave town for a work trip, but the timing didn't quite line up, so I decided to spend the day at home. I had no reason to doubt her or their meetings, but a part of me wanted to see for myself. I never thought I'd need to spy on my wife. That wasn't who I was. But something inside me whispered that this wasn't as innocent as it seemed. I watched as she prepared to leave for another lunch with him. She dressed differently that day, more carefully. It wasn't that she was trying to impress anyone, at least, that's what I told myself. But the way she moved, the way she adjusted her shirt before stepping out, caught my attention. Her hair was done just a little more neatly, her makeup a little more polished. She wasn't trying to look her best for me. I was sure of that. She was going to meet him. I didn't say anything, of course. She left with the same casual air as before, and I watched her go, my stomach turning in a way I couldn't explain. She didn't notice me watching, didn't notice the unease that gripped me as I realized that, at that moment, I wasn't the most important thing in her world. When she returned later that afternoon, there was a certain ease about her. She smiled, yes, but it wasn't just the usual smile she gave me. It was warmer, more genuine. She was happy, happy in a way I hadn't seen in weeks. I tried to ignore it, tried to dismiss the unease that grew in my chest as she walked through the door. But it was impossible. It felt as if she were carrying something with her, a joy, a lightness, that wasn't meant for me. I greeted her as I always did, asking about her day, about the lunch. She answered, but there was a slight hesitation in her voice. She wasn't hiding anything, not in the way I might have suspected, but she wasn't completely forthcoming either. There was a subtle edge to her responses, a guardedness that I hadn't seen before. She told me, of course, about the time they had spent together, about their shared memories, about their lives since they had last spoken. But in her eyes, there was something more, something that didn't belong to me. It was then that I knew. I could feel it deep in my bones. This wasn't just an innocent reunion. There was more to it, more that she wasn't telling me. As the days passed, I began to see it more clearly. Her smiles, her energy, the way she spoke to me, it was all different. Not because she didn't love me, but because she was giving something to him that she was no longer giving to me. Something I had taken for granted, something I had assumed would always be there. And now, I wasn't so sure. There was intimacy in the way she spoke of him, a connection that I couldn't deny, even though I didn't know the full extent of it. And I was left here, standing in the shadows, wondering when I'd stop being enough. It wasn't something I had planned to happen. I never thought I would be the kind of man who would spy on his wife, who would seek out the evidence of something he wasn't ready to face. But one evening, as the days blurred together in the quiet rhythm of our home, something changed. The lingering suspicion that had haunted me for weeks finally came to a head. I had come home early from work that day, an unusual thing for me. There had been no particular reason for the early departure, other than a sudden shift in my mood, a restlessness I couldn't shake. When I walked through the door, the house felt empty, a strange stillness hanging in the air. The silence wasn't uncommon, but tonight it felt wrong. I dropped my bag by the door and made my way toward the living room. The familiar sights, her book stacked neatly, the framed photos of our family, seemed to offer little comfort now. The house didn't feel like home anymore. It felt foreign, as if I was an intruder in a space I no longer understood. I decided to wait. Maybe I was overthinking everything. Maybe the growing distance between us wasn't as significant as I had imagined. I could have been wrong about the way she spoke, about the little shifts in her behavior. Maybe I had just been too sensitive, too wrapped up in my own insecurities. I sat down in my usual chair, hands pressed against my knees, waiting for her to come home. Hours passed. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, the minutes stretching longer than I wanted to admit. By now, I was beginning to lose patience. She was late. It wasn't like her to stay out this late without calling. I had always trusted her to keep me informed, to share the small details of her day. But tonight, it felt different. I picked up my phone, half-heartedly scrolling through messages, and that's when I saw it. A message from her. A simple text, no different from any other one she had sent me in the past. But this one stood out. It was brief, almost curt, and there was an undertone to it that caught my attention. "I'm running late. I'll be home soon." I stared at the words for a moment, feeling a strange weight in my chest. It wasn't the content of the message that troubled me, it was the tone, the way it was written, the lack of warmth, the brevity of it. It felt distant, and that was all it took to tip the scales. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that this wasn't just another evening. So, without thinking, I grabbed my jacket and left the house. I told myself I was just going to check on her, make sure everything was okay, nothing more. But deep down, I knew exactly what I was doing. I was following my instincts, the gnawing suspicion that had been growing in me for weeks. I drove in silence, my mind racing with possibilities. The streets outside were dark, quiet, but the weight of what I might find felt heavy on my shoulders. I didn't know exactly where she was, but I had a pretty good idea. She had been meeting him more frequently lately, always at the same restaurant, the same quiet spot where they could talk and reconnect. A part of me hated the thought, but another part, the part that had been drowning in doubt for weeks, needed to see it for myself. When I arrived, the restaurant was almost empty. I parked the car in the lot, sitting for a moment in the stillness, watching the lights inside flicker as people came and went. My heart beat loudly in my chest, and I told myself to calm down. It wasn't anything. It was nothing. But then, to the window, I saw them. They were sitting together at a corner booth, just the two of them. She was leaning in slightly, her body turned toward him. They were talking, their faces close. She was laughing, a sound that once filled our house but now seemed foreign, as if it didn't belong in the space between them. The way her eyes sparkled, the way her lips curved in that smile, it wasn't the smile I had grown used to. It was different, a smile that had been absent from her life for weeks, maybe months. And then, I saw it, the touch. She reached across the table, and he took her hand in his fingers curling around hers in a way that was intimate, unspoken, but unmistakable. It was a gesture that felt so natural, so at ease, and I knew in that moment that I was no longer the man she shared those touches with. I sat there, frozen in my car, staring through the glass. Time seemed to stretch, and all I could hear was the sound of my own breath, shallow and quick, as if the world had fallen silent. I watched them for what felt like an eternity, but the truth was clear. There was nothing innocent about the way they were together. There was no denying it. They were more than friends. I don't know how long I sat there before I finally started the car again. My hand shook as I gripped the steering wheel. The drive home was a blur. I wasn't thinking clearly, wasn't sure what to do with the knowledge that was now burning inside me. All I knew was that everything I believed, everything I thought I understood about my life and my marriage, was a lie. When I got home, I sat in the dark, staring at the walls. I didn't know how to react, didn't know what to say. My mind raced, each thought tumbling over the next in a chaotic spiral. I was angry, yes, but more than that, I was devastated. I thought I knew her. I thought we had something real. But now, all I could feel was the weight of betrayal crushing me. The life I thought I had was slipping away, and I had no idea how to stop it. She came in a few hours later, her steps light, but there was something in her eyes, a wariness that wasn't there before. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. We both knew what had happened. We both knew the truth now, and neither of us could pretend anymore. The woman I had loved, the woman I had trusted with everything, was no longer the woman standing before me, and I didn't know where to go from here. The weight of what I had seen that night didn't lift. It clung to me, gnawing at my insides, poisoning every thought. She had betrayed me. She had given herself to him, and I had seen it with my own eyes. The image of their hands entwined, the way her body leaned toward him, the smiles and glances, they all haunted me, replaying over and over, mocking my weakness. The warmth I once felt when I looked at her was gone, replaced with a cold, crushing emptiness. But more than the betrayal, it was the realization that she had hidden this from me for so long that cut the deepest. I had never been the type to act impulsively, to lash out without thinking. But this was different. My life had been turned upside down, and I wasn't a man I used to be. The anger had taken root, and with it came a burning desire for revenge. The days that followed were a blur. I barely spoke to her, barely acknowledged her presence. Every time I looked at her, all I could see was the woman who had deceived me, who had shared herself with someone else. The house felt suffocating, the walls closing in around me as I planned what I needed to do. He was still in the picture, still meeting her, still taking what was once mine. but I knew what had to happen. He couldn't be allowed to continue. No one could. I began to gather what I needed, the tools of revenge. It wasn't a decision I made lightly, but it felt like the only thing left to do. My mind was clouded with rage, and the thought of confronting him face to face in some quiet, civil manner seemed foolish. No, this had to be this had to be final. I had never used a gun before, but I wasn't a fool. I knew how to get one, how to make sure it would be effective. It was a small, simple thing, but it would do the job. I thought about it constantly. Where? When? How? I had no doubt in my mind. Dee would pay. Then, there was her. My wife, the woman I had spent decades with. She was a part of this too. She had betrayed me in the most intimate way possible, and I couldn't let her off scot-free. She had to understand the weight of her actions, feel the sting of the same betrayal she had inflicted on me. It wasn't just about punishment. It was about reclaiming what had been stolen from me. I waited for the right moment, for the perfect opportunity to strike. I wasn't sure how long I could keep up the facade, pretending everything was normal, pretending to still be the man she once knew. But it didn't matter. I would keep my silence until the time was right. Then it came, another evening, another night when he'd be there, when she would be with him. I didn't know where exactly, but I knew where they usually went. The same quiet restaurant, the same empty tables. I would be waiting. I arrived early, slipping into the shadows, hidden just enough so I could see them when they walked in. My heart pounded in my chest as the minutes ticked by, the anticipation curling around my throat like a vice. I watched the door, my eyes never leaving it, as I prepared myself. Then, there they were. She stepped in first, smiling that same smile I had seen before, the one that was not for me. He followed closely behind, his presence far too familiar to me now. The sight of them together sent a wave of nausea through me, but I forced myself to stay calm. This was it. I stood up, adjusting the gun at my side. No one noticed me. I had made sure of that. The noise of the restaurant, the hum of conversation, drowned out my steps. I was a ghost, moving silently, unnoticed. I walked toward them, slow and deliberate. When they finally saw me, it was too late. He didn't even have time to react before I pulled the trigger. The shot rang out, sharp and final. There was no hesitation in my movement, no second thoughts. He crumpled. A look of disbelief etched on his face as he fell to the ground, lifeless. Her scream was the only sound that pierced the air. It wasn't a scream of fear, it was the sound of realization, of horror at what had just happened. She looked at me, her face pale and stunned, and for a moment, I saw something in her eyes, something I hadn't seen in years. Regret. Tear. But it didn't matter. Nothing mattered anymore. I turned toward her, the gun still clutched tightly in my hand. My heart pounding as the adrenaline surged through me. She stood frozen, her body trembling, her lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. She had no words left. I took a step toward her, my voice low and calm, but my insides were churning. You thought you could have both of us, I said, my tone cold. You thought you could deceive me, use me, and I wouldn't notice. But I saw everything, and now, you understand what it feels like to lose everything. She opened her mouth as if to protest, to beg for mercy, but I didn't give her the chance. I had waited for this moment, and now, it was time to make her feel the same pain she had inflicted on me. I moved closer, watching her with eyes that had long since abandoned love and replaced it with something far darker. I grabbed her arm, pulling her toward me with a force that left her no room to resist. She was weak, trembling under my touch. The fear in her eyes was palpable, but it wasn't enough. It didn't satisfy me. It wasn't enough to erase the years of betrayal, the hollow emptiness I felt inside. I gave you everything, I whispered, my grip tightening. And this is how you repay me? She couldn't answer. She couldn't speak. She was paralyzed by her own guilt, by the consequences of what she had done. But it didn't matter. She had broken me, and now, it was my turn to break her. The silence that followed was deafening, and as I looked down at her, the world around me seemed to fade away. There was no going back now. I had crossed a line, and there was no way to undo the damage. The finality of it all settled in. I had done it. I had taken what was mine, and I would never be the man I was before. The air in the restaurant was thick with tension, heavy and suffocating. The once lively space had become a tomb, the flickering light overhead casting long, grim shadows over the scene. I stood there, the gun still clutched tightly in my hand, my pulse a steady thrum in my ears. My body was rigid, frozen in place, as the gravity of what had just happened began to settle around me like a suffocating blanket. She stood across from me, her face pale, her eyes wide with disbelief. She had been the center of my world, once. Now, she was just another woman who had betrayed me, another piece of the life I had worked so hard to build, now shattered beyond recognition. The weight of her actions hung over us, thick and oppressive. Her betrayal, her decision to share herself with another man, was now laid bare before me. The very woman who had promised to be with me for better or worse had chosen someone else, someone who was not me. The betrayal wasn't just a violation of trust. It was a violation of everything we had built, of every moment we had shared. The love I had once felt for her had withered and died, replaced by something far darker and far more powerful. She did not speak, but her presence was enough. The cold look in her eyes, the tremble in her hands, told me everything I needed to know. She knew what she had done. She knew there was no turning back. But it didn't matter. Nothing mattered anymore. She had made her choice, and now she would face the consequences. I turned my back to her, my movements slow and deliberate. I didn't need to look at her anymore. There was nothing left to say. The pain of her betrayal had been raw and jagged when I first discovered it, but now it had transformed into something else, something colder, more calculated. The gun in my hand felt heavy, but it no longer felt full. It felt like an extension of the rage that had consumed me, like the tool of justice in my hands. The only justice I had left to claim. As I walked toward the door, I felt a flicker of movement behind me. I didn't turn. I didn't need to. I could feel her presence, the weight of her gaze burning into my back, but I had no intention of stopping. The path I had set for myself was clear, and I would not let anything or anyone divert me from it. I had done what needed to be done, and now I would leave it all behind. The silence that followed was suffocating. It pressed in on me, yet I didn't feel the weight of regret or guilt that might have consumed another man. No, for me, it was liberation. The heavy burden of betrayal had been lifted from my shoulders, and now I was free. Free from her lies. Free from the life we had built together. Free from the man who had taken what was mine. It was an unsettling freedom, but it was mine nonetheless. I stepped out into the night, the cool air filling my lungs, grounding me in the reality of what had just transpired. The city around me felt distant, as if I were moving through a dream, disconnected from everything I once knew. But that didn't matter. All that mattered was that I had taken control. I had finally made my move, and now the pieces of my shattered life had begun to fall back into place. The events of the night replayed in my mind, each moment seared into my memory. The gunshot, his fall, her scream, the finality of it all. I had claimed my revenge. But even as the taste of it lingered, something deep inside me knew that I would never be the same. I had crossed a line, and there was no going back. The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of clarity. The rage that had consumed me was fading, replaced by something else. A cold satisfaction, a sense of closure. I had done what I needed to do, and now it was time to walk away. There was no going back to who I had been, and I wouldn't try. I had faced the truth of what she had done, and in doing so, I had reclaimed a piece of myself. The love I had once felt for her was gone, replaced by a deep, unyielding sense of finality. The man I was had died with her betrayal, but in his place stood something stronger, something harder. As I walked away from the place where it all began, I knew that whatever came next, I would face it head on. There was no fear in me now. There was only the cold, unrelenting truth of what I had done, and the certainty that I would never allow myself to be broken again. I had taken my revenge. I had done what needed to be done, and now the world would have to reckon with the man I had become. And that's the end of today's story. If you enjoyed this journey, please give this video a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more incredible stories like this one. Got thoughts or experiences you'd like to share? Drop them in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care.